The bitter wind howled across the desolate Wyoming plains as the last shovelful of frozen earth fell upon the twin graves. Victoria Valmont, just 19 years old, stood motionless at the edge of the makeshift cemetery, her sisters huddled close against the punishing cold. 4 young women, now alone in the world, watched as their parents were laid to rest in the unforgiving ground of Cherry Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1876. "What happens now?" whispered 12-year-old Eliza, her small hand clutching Victoria's skirt. 14-year-old Margaret wiped silent tears while the youngest, 10-year-old Abigail, buried her face in Victoria's side, unable to watch as the final prayers were spoken over their parents' graves. Victoria stared at the weathered crosses that now marked where Thomas and Eleanor Valmont lay. The fever had taken them both within days of each other, leaving their 4 daughters orphaned as winter descended upon their small homestead with merciless fury. "We survive," Victoria answered simply, though her voice threatened to break. "We must survive." The small gathering of neighbors dispersed quickly as the wind picked up, carrying the promise of another snowstorm. The Valmont sisters trudged back to their cabin, a ramshackle structure barely standing against the elements. The roof leaked, the windows failed to keep out the drafts, and the walls seemed to creak with every gust of wind. Without their father to maintain it, the cabin had fallen into disrepair over the last year as illness had slowly claimed his strength. That night, huddled together on a single mattress for warmth, Victoria stared at the ceiling, listening to her sister's quiet breathing. Their provisions would last perhaps another month if carefully rationed. The cow had stopped giving milk weeks ago, and the chicken coop stood empty after foxes had taken the last of their hens. Their father's hunting rifle remained, but Victoria had never fired it, and game was scarce in the deep winter. "We will not die here," she whispered fiercely into the darkness. "I promise you, Mother. I promise you, Father, I will keep them safe." The next morning brought clear skies but bitter cold. Victoria wrapped herself in her father's old coat and ventured outside to chop what little firewood remained. Her hands, red and raw, struggled with the axe as she awkwardly swung it at a log. The blade glanced off, nearly striking her foot. "You'll lose a toe that way, miss," called a deep voice. Victoria whirled around, axe raised defensively, to see a tall figure on horseback at the edge of their property. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace and approached slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. "Name's Bennett Jackson," he said, removing his hat to reveal sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. "Folks call me Ben, just moved to the Jackson place down the valley." He nodded toward the distant foothills. "Saw the burial yesterday. Thought I might check if you folks needed anything." Victoria lowered the axe slightly but remained wary. "We're managing fine, Mr. Jackson." Ben's gaze traveled from the poorly stacked firewood to the sagging roof of the cabin and back to Victoria's thin frame, clearly unconvinced. "No disrespect intended, miss, but that roof won't hold through the next snowfall." "And what business is that of yours?" Victoria challenged, though her voice lacked conviction. She knew he was right. Ben replaced his hat and shrugged. "None at all. But I've got 2 good hands and know my way around a hammer. Lost my own folks young. Know what it's like to face winter alone." Before Victoria could respond, the cabin door creaked open and Abigail peered out, her small face brightening at the sight of the visitor. "Are you an angel?" she asked, earning a deep chuckle from Ben. "No, little one, just a neighbor." He turned back to Victoria. "Let me help. No strings attached, just one Christian soul helping another." Victoria studied him carefully. Bennett Jackson appeared to be in his late 20s, tall and broad-shouldered from years of hard work. His clothes were worn but clean, his manner direct but gentle. Most importantly, there was no pity in his eyes, only understanding. "We can't pay you," she said finally. "Not asking for payment," he replied simply. "Winter's long in these parts, neighbors need to look after each other." After a moment's hesitation, Victoria nodded. "The roof leaks worst above the kitchen." Ben smiled, and something in Victoria's chest tightened unexpectedly. "I'll fetch my tools," he said, already heading back to his horse. That afternoon, the rhythmic sound of hammering filled the air as Ben worked on the roof. Inside, Victoria stretched their meager provisions into a stew while her sisters watched the stranger with undisguised curiosity through the windows. "He's handsome," Margaret whispered, earning a stern look from Victoria. "He's helping us out of Christian charity," Victoria corrected. Nothing more. But even as she said it, she found herself stealing glances at the cowboy as he worked. His movements were efficient and purposeful, his strong hands making quick work of the damaged shingles. When he caught her looking and tipped his hat with a smile, Victoria quickly returned her attention to the stew, her cheeks burning despite the cabin's chill. Ben stayed until dusk, patching the worst of the roof and promising to return the next day. True to his word, he arrived at first light with his wagon loaded with supplies, lumber, nails, and to the girls' delight, a small crate of provisions. "Can't have you starving while I fix this place up," he said matter-of-factly when Victoria began to protest. "My ma would rise from her grave and tan my hide if she knew I let 4 young ladies go hungry." Over the next week, Ben became a fixture at the Valmont homestead. He repaired the roof properly, fixed the drafty windows, and reinforced the walls against the wind. Victoria initially kept her distance, maintaining a polite but reserved demeanor, but her sisters took to him immediately. Abigail followed him like a shadow, asking endless questions about his horse and his ranch. Margaret blushed whenever he spoke to her directly, while practical Eliza paid close attention to everything he did, storing away knowledge for future use. On the 7th day, as Victoria prepared a simple meal from the provisions Ben had brought, she finally asked the question that had been troubling her. "Why are you doing all this, Mr. Jackson?" Ben paused in his work on a cabinet door that had long since come off its hinges. "5 years ago, I was riding through Montana territory," he began, his voice taking on a distant quality. "Got caught in a blizzard, thought for sure I was done for. A family took me in the Carsons. They had nothing to spare, but they shared their fire and their food, saved my life." He looked up, meeting Victoria's gaze directly. "Mr. Carson told me something I never forgot, said that out here, kindness isn't charity, it's survival." Victoria nodded slowly, understanding. "And have you repaid them, the Carsons?" A shadow passed over Ben's features. "Never got the chance. When I went back the next spring to thank them proper, I found their place burned to the ground. Bandits, the locals said." He returned to his work, his hands moving with renewed purpose. "So I promised myself I'd pass on what they gave me, that's all this is." That night, after Ben had left and her sisters were asleep, Victoria stood at the window, watching the moon cast silver light across the snow-covered landscape. For the first time since her parents' death, the cabin felt truly warm and secure. She thought of Ben's story and the haunted look in his eyes when he spoke of the Carsons. There was more to Bennett Jackson than met the eye, she decided. Much more. The next morning brought another snowstorm, fierce enough to keep Ben away. The sisters spent the day indoors, more comfortable than they had been in months thanks to his repairs. Victoria used the time to take stock of their situation. The provisions Ben had brought would last them another 2 weeks with careful rationing, but what then? Their father's small savings had been depleted by the doctor's bills during his illness. The homestead itself was mortgaged to the bank in town, with payments due come spring. "We need a plan," Victoria murmured to herself as she mended one of Abigail's dresses by lamplight. Her sewing skills were adequate, learned at her mother's knee. Perhaps she could offer her services to the townspeople or take in laundry. The thought of being beholden to Ben's charity indefinitely sat poorly with her independent spirit. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, Ben arrived with fresh game, 2 rabbits and a grouse and more supplies. This time, Victoria met him at the door with determination in her eyes. "I want to learn," she said without preamble. Ben raised an eyebrow. "Learn what exactly?" "Everything. How to hunt, how to repair things, how to," she gestured vaguely, "survive out here without depending on anyone's charity." For a moment, Ben looked taken aback, then a slow smile spread across his face. "Well now, Miss Valmont, that's the most sensible thing I've heard in a long while." And so began Victoria's education in frontier survival. Ben taught her to use her father's rifle, patiently correcting her stance and breathing until she could hit a target consistently. He showed her how to set snares for rabbits and where to find wild onions and other edibles even under the snow. Eliza often joined these lessons, her practical mind quickly grasping the concepts Ben shared. The other girls contributed in their own ways. Margaret, who had inherited their mother's knack for cooking, stretched their provisions into hearty meals that filled the cabin with comforting aromas. Abigail kept their spirits up with her irrepressible optimism and stories, often making up tales about Ben as a heroic cowboy saving entire towns from outlaws. As January gave way to February, a routine developed. Ben would arrive in the morning, work on improving the cabin, teach Victoria and sometimes Eliza new skills, and stay for the evening meal before returning to his own ranch. On Sundays, he would escort all 4 sisters to the small church in Cherry Creek, where the locals eyed them with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. It was after one such church service that trouble found them. As they walked back to Ben's wagon, Sheriff Davis approached, his expression grim. "Miss Valmont," he said, nodding respectfully to Victoria. "Might I have a word?" Victoria tensed but nodded, stepping aside with the lawman while Ben distracted her sisters. "I've had word from the bank," Davis said without preamble. "They're calling in your father's loan early. New management from back east, looking to consolidate their holdings." Victoria felt as though the ground had dropped from beneath her feet. "But that's not right. We have until spring." Davis shook his head sympathetically. "I'm sorry, but legally they're within their rights. You have until the end of the month to settle the debt, or they'll take possession of the property." Victoria walked back to the wagon in a daze, barely registering her sister's chatter on the ride home. Only when they reached the cabin did Ben notice her distress. "Girls, why don't you go inside and get dinner started?" he suggested, helping them down from the wagon. When they were out of earshot, he turned to Victoria. What did Davis want? In halting words, she explained the situation. The bank wanted $50 a fortune for 4 orphaned girls with no income. Ben listened quietly, his jaw tightening. When she finished, he simply said, "I'll speak to them." "No," Victoria said firmly. "This is our problem, not yours. You've done more than enough already." "Victoria, I mean it, Ben," she interrupted, using his first name for the first time. "You've taught me that survival out here means standing on your own 2 feet. Let me stand." Their eyes locked in silent battle, neither willing to yield. Finally, Ben nodded once, respecting her decision though clearly unhappy with it. That night, after her sisters were asleep, Victoria pulled out her mother's jewelry box. There wasn't much: a simple wedding band, a cameo brooch, and a silver locket that had been in the family for generations. Together, they might fetch $20 if the shopkeeper in town was feeling generous. Not nearly enough. The next morning, Victoria rose before dawn and dressed in her warmest clothes. She left a note for her sisters explaining that she had gone to town on business and would return by nightfall. Then she set out on foot, the 5-mile journey to Cherry Creek stretching before her like an impossible distance. The sun was barely clearing the eastern hills when she arrived at the town's lone hotel, the Silver Spur. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and approached the front desk where a sleepy clerk looked up in surprise. "I'd like to speak with the owner," Victoria said, removing her gloves. "I'm looking for work." The clerk eyed her skeptically. "Mrs. Holbrook doesn't usually hire girls from the homesteads." "Please," Victoria insisted, "tell her I'm willing to do any honest work." After a moment's hesitation, the clerk disappeared through a door behind the desk. Minutes later, a severe-looking woman in her 50s emerged, appraising Victoria with sharp eyes. "You're Thomas Valmont's girl," she stated rather than asked. Victoria nodded. "Yes, madam, Victoria Valmont, and you're looking for work, Mrs." Holbrook's tone made it clear what she thought of the idea. "This is a respectable establishment, Miss Valmont." "As am I a respectable woman," Victoria replied evenly. "I can clean, so serve meals, whatever you need." Mrs. Holbrook studied her for a long moment. "Why now?" "Your family's been struggling for months, from what I hear." Victoria hesitated, then decided honesty was her only option. "The bank is calling in my father's loan early. We'll lose the homestead if I can't raise $50 by month's end." Something flickered in the older woman's eyes, perhaps recognition of a similar struggle from her own past. I can offer you $2 a week for cleaning rooms and helping in the kitchen. No more. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough to save their home in time, but it was something. Victoria nodded gratefully. When can I start? Right now, Mrs. Holbrook said briskly. The breakfast rush will begin soon. Victoria spent the day in a blur of activity, scrubbing floors, changing linens, washing dishes, and serving meals to the hotel's guests. By sunset, her back ached and her hands were raw, but she had earned her first $2. Mrs. Holbrook also allowed her to take home leftover bread and stew for her sisters. The walk home in the gathering darkness was long and lonely. Victoria's feet dragged with exhaustion, and doubts plagued her mind. At this rate, she would need nearly 6 weeks to earn enough to pay the bank time she didn't have. As she crested the final hill before their homestead, Victoria stopped short. The cabin glowed with warm light and smoke curled invitingly from the chimney. But that wasn't what surprised her. Beside their modest home stood the wooden frame of a new structure, partially enclosed with fresh lumber. Ben's wagon was parked nearby. Victoria hurried the rest of the way, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. She found all 3 of her sisters and Ben inside the cabin, seated around the table while Margaret served up a rabbit stew. "Victoria," Abigail cried, leaping up to embrace her. "Look what Ben's building us." "A proper house with rooms for everyone?" Victoria stared at Ben, who had risen to his feet when she entered. "What is the meaning of this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben met her gaze steadily. "Your sisters told me where you'd gone. Thought I'd make myself useful while you were earning wages." He gestured toward the window. "Figured you could all use more space than this old cabin provides." "We can't afford a new house," Victoria said, her voice catching. "We can barely keep the one we have." "The lumber was just sitting at my place," Ben said with a shrug. "Had it shipped in last fall for my own expansion, but..." He trailed off, looking slightly embarrassed. "Well, seems it's found a better use here." Victoria felt tears threatening and turned away quickly, unpacking the food misses. Holbrook had given her to hide her emotion. "You had no right to make such a decision without consulting me." "Victoria," Eliza said softly, "don't be angry, we helped plan it. Ben asked what we thought would make a proper home." "I'm not angry," Victoria said, though her tone suggested otherwise. She couldn't find the right words, overwhelmed, grateful, frightened by the implications of such generosity. "I need some air," she finally said, stepping back outside. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered like diamond dust across the black sky. Victoria wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the wooden skeleton of what would someday be a real house, the kind her parents had always dreamed of building but never had the means to complete. She heard the cabin door open and close behind her, followed by Ben's measured footsteps. "I've overstepped," he said simply, coming to stand beside her. "If you want me to stop, I will." Victoria turned to look at him, this man who had appeared in their lives like an answer to an unspoken prayer. "Why?" she asked, the question encompassing so much more than just the house. Ben was silent for a long moment, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "When I first saw you at your parents' funeral," he finally said, "you reminded me of someone, myself, after my folks died, too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to admit you needed it." He smiled slightly. "Thought maybe God put me in your path for a reason." "And what reason would that be?" "To remind you that you're not alone." Ben turned to face her fully. "Victoria, this territory breaks people who try to stand alone. It's too big, too harsh. We survive by leaning on each other." Victoria felt the tears she'd been holding back finally spill over. "The bank wants $50 by the end of the month," she confessed. "I made $2 today." Ben nodded, unsurprised. "I figured it was something like that. Sheriff Davis isn't exactly subtle when he delivers bad news." "I won't take your money," Victoria said firmly, wiping away her tears. "Didn't offer it," Ben replied with a slight smile. "But I might have a different solution. The cattle drive to Cheyenne will be heading out next week. They're short-handed and they pay $30 for the journey." Victoria stared at him. "They won't hire a woman." "No," Ben agreed, "but they'll hire me, and with what I've saved from the last drive plus that 30. He let the implication hang in the air. "I can't ask you to do that." You didn't ask, I'm offering. Ben's gaze was steady. Let me do this, Victoria, not as charity, but as, he hesitated, as someone who cares what happens to you and your sisters. Something in his tone made Victoria's heart beat faster. She looked away, back toward the frame of the new house, considering his words. If you did this, she said carefully, how would I repay you? By accepting that sometimes it's all right to let someone help, he answered simply. And maybe. He added, his voice dropping lower, by considering that I might have reasons beyond Christian charity for wanting to see you and your sisters safe and settled. Victoria's breath caught in her throat as their eyes met again. In the moonlight, Ben's expression was open, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. I should go back inside, she said softly. My sisters will be wondering. Ben nodded, but as she turned to leave, he gently caught her hand. Think about it, Victoria, please. His touch was warm despite the cold night, and Victoria found herself reluctant to pull away. I will, she promised. That night, lying awake in the crowded bed she shared with her sisters, Victoria turned Ben's offer over and over in her mind. The cattle drive would take him away for nearly 2 weeks, during which they would be alone again, yet if it meant saving their home. And then there were his other words, the ones that had made her heart race. Reasons beyond Christian charity. What exactly had he meant? Victoria had never had time for courtship or romance, especially since her parents' illness had required all her attention. At 19, she was already considered an old maid by some in Cherry Creek, but Ben Jackson was different from the local boys who occasionally cast glances her way at church. He was a man who had faced hardship and loss, who understood what it meant to build a life from nothing. A man who looked at her not with pity but with respect and perhaps something more. Morning brought clarity. When Ben arrived to continue work on the new house, Victoria met him with a decision. I accept your offer, she said without preamble, but with conditions. This will be a loan, not a gift. I'll repay every cent with interest. Ben's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. I'd expect nothing less from you, Miss Valmont. And Victoria continued, steeling herself, when you return from the cattle drive, we should discuss these reasons of yours, properly. Something flickered in Ben's eyes, hope perhaps, or joy quickly contained. I'd like that very much, he said quietly. With the decision made, preparations began in earnest. Ben worked from dawn until dusk on the new house, determined to enclose it before he left for the cattle drive. Victoria continued working at the hotel, saving every penny while learning the rhythm of a job that might sustain them in the future. The sisters contributed their own labor to the building project. Even young Abigail helped by carrying nails and holding boards in place while Ben secured them. By the end of the week, the structure had walls, a solid roof, and glass windows that Ben had brought from town at considerable expense. It's not finished inside, he explained the night before his departure, but it's weathertight. You can move in while I'm gone if you like, or wait until I return to help with the rest. The 5 of them stood in what would be the main room of the new house, admiring the solid construction. A proper fireplace stood at one end, ready for its first fire. The walls were bare wood waiting for whitewash, but the floor was smooth and level. It's beautiful, Margaret whispered, running her hand along a window frame, like something from a storybook. Will you put in a special shelf for my books? Abigail asked, tugging at Ben's sleeve. Though she owned only 3 worn volumes, they were her most prized possessions. Ben smiled down at her. Anything for you, Miss Abigail. I'll build shelves for every room when I get back. Victoria watched this exchange with a lump in her throat. In just a few short weeks, Ben had become essential to them all. The thought of his absence, even temporary, left an ache she hadn't expected. Later, after her sisters had gone to bed in the old cabin, Victoria and Ben stood alone in the new house, their lantern casting long shadows on the unfinished walls. I've left firewood stacked by both houses, Ben said, his voice low in the quiet space. And there's salt pork and flour in the cupboard, enough to last until I return. If you need anything, Sheriff Davis knows to keep an eye out for you. Victoria nodded, suddenly unable to speak. Ben would leave at first light, riding to join the cattle drive as it passed through the northern route. 2 weeks, if all went well. 2 weeks that suddenly seemed an eternity. Victoria, Ben said softly, stepping closer, I need you to know something before I go. She looked up at him, at this man who had changed their lives so completely in such a short time. What is it? Ben took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. When I first saw you at the funeral, I felt something I can't quite explain, like I was meant to help you. He smiled slightly. But these past weeks, working alongside you, watching how you care for your sisters, seeing your strength. My feelings have changed. Victoria's heart hammered in her chest. Changed how? I didn't expect to care for you this way, he admitted. It's too soon, I know that. You're still grieving your parents and you've got those girls depending on you. He gestured toward the cabin where her sisters slept. But when I return, if you're willing, I'd like to court you properly, with your permission. The words hung in the air between them, a declaration and a question both. Victoria found herself studying his face in the lantern light, the strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his right eyebrow, the earnest blue eyes that held her steadily, awaiting her answer. Yes, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I would like that very much. Ben's smile was radiant. Slowly, giving her every chance to step away, he reached for her hand. When she didn't pull back, he raised it to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I'll come back to you, he promised, as soon as I can. The morning of Ben's departure dawned clear and cold. All 4 Valmont sisters stood outside the cabin to see him off, Abigail clinging to his leg until the last moment. Bring us something from Cheyenne, she called as he mounted his horse. Abigail, Victoria admonished, Mr. Jackson isn't going on a pleasure trip. Ben laughed, settling into his saddle. I'll see what I can find for you, little miss. Maybe a new book if there's a proper store. He tipped his hat to the older girls, his gaze lingering on Victoria. 2 weeks, he said, the words a promise. We'll be waiting, Victoria replied, suddenly conscious of her sister's curious eyes upon her. They watched until he disappeared over the hill, Abigail waving long after he was out of sight. Only when the last dust from his horse's hooves had settled did Victoria turn back to the cabin, squaring her shoulders. Come on, girls, she said briskly. We've work to do. The days after Ben's departure fell into a new routine. Victoria continued working at the hotel, walking the 5 miles each way while her sisters maintained the homestead. In the evenings, they worked on preparing the new house, sweeping the floors and organizing their meager possessions for the eventual move. A week passed, then 10 days. Victoria found herself watching the horizon each evening as she walked home, hoping for a glimpse of a returning rider. But the trail remained empty. On the 12th day, a fierce storm blew in from the north, bringing sleet and howling winds. Victoria was forced to stay overnight at the hotel, fretting about her sisters alone in the cabin. When she finally made it home the next morning, she found them safe but subdued. Do you think the storm caught Mr. Jackson on the trail? Margaret asked as they huddled around the fire that evening. He's an experienced rider, Victoria assured her, though the same worry had been gnawing at her own heart. I'm sure he found shelter. 2 more days passed with no word. The bank's deadline loomed just a week away. Victoria tried to focus on her work, on caring for her sisters, on anything but the growing fear that something had happened to Ben. On the morning of the 15th day, Victoria was scrubbing the hotel's kitchen floor when Mrs. Holbrook appeared in the doorway. There's someone asking for you at the front desk, she said, her expression unreadable. Victoria's heart leapt, then plummeted as she took in the older woman's grave demeanor. Rising to her feet, she wiped her hands on her apron and followed Mrs. Holbrook to the lobby. Sheriff Davis waited there, hat in hand, his weathered face solemn. Miss Valmont, he began, then hesitated. What's happened? Victoria asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fear coursing through her. Is it been Mr. Jackson? Davis nodded grimly. There was trouble on the trail. Rustlers hit the herd near the Laramie crossing. Jackson was wounded defending the cattle. The room seemed to tilt around Victoria. How badly? She whispered. Took a bullet to the shoulder, Davis said. They brought him to the doctor's office not an hour ago. He was asking for you. Relief warred with concern as Victoria untied her apron with trembling fingers. Mrs. Holbrook, I need to go, the older woman interrupted, her stern facade softening slightly. Your day's wages are on the desk. See to your man." Victoria was too preoccupied to correct the assumption as she hurried out into the street, nearly running the 2 blocks to Dr. Wilson's small office. She burst through the door, startling the elderly physician who was washing his hands in a basin. "Where is he?" she demanded without preamble. "Doctor." Wilson nodded toward a door at the back. "Just finished removing the bullet. He's weak from blood loss but should recover with proper care." He eyed Victoria speculatively. "You his wife?" "No," Victoria said, then added more firmly, "Not yet. May I see him?" The doctor gestured for her to enter the back room. Victoria steeled herself before pushing open the door, unsure what condition she might find Ben in. He lay on a narrow cot, his upper body bare except for white bandages wrapped around his left shoulder and chest. His face was pale, eyes closed, but his breathing seemed steady. Victoria approached quietly, not wanting to disturb his rest. As if sensing her presence, Ben's eyes fluttered open. When he saw her, a weak smile spread across his face. "You're a sight for sore eyes," he murmured. Victoria sank onto the small stool beside the cot, relief making her knees weak. "What happened?" she asked softly, resisting the urge to touch him to reassure herself that he was really there. "Rustlers," Ben confirmed, wincing as he tried to shift position. "6 of them hit us at dawn. Got away with 20 head before we drove them off," he grimaced. "One of them was a better shot than I'd like." "You could have been killed," Victoria said, the reality of it hitting her anew. "Takes more than 1 bullet to keep me down," Ben replied, though his pallor suggested otherwise. With obvious effort, he reached toward the small table beside the cot. Besides, had promises to keep. Victoria followed his gaze to a small cloth-wrapped package on the table. "What's that?" for Abigail, Ben explained. "Found a bookshop in Cheyenne. Robinson Crusoe thought she might like it." Tears sprang to Victoria's eyes at this evidence of his thoughtfulness even in the midst of danger. "You remembered." "Course I did." Ben's eyes held hers, suddenly serious. "Remembered everything, including what we talked about before I left." Victoria glanced toward the door, aware of the doctor's presence in the outer office. "This isn't the time, it's exactly the time," Ben interrupted gently. "When you're staring down a gun barrel, you get real clear on what matters." He took a shaky breath. "And what matters to me, Victoria Valmont, is you and those girls." Victoria's heart seemed to stop, then race forward. "Ben, let me finish," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I know it's fast, too fast maybe, but out here life doesn't wait for proper timing." With visible effort, he reached for her hand. "I care for you, Victoria, more than I thought possible in such a short time, and if you'll let me, I want to court you properly, like I said before. But more than that, I want to build a future with you and your sisters." Victoria stared at him, this man who had come into their lives like a miracle, who had built them a home and now offered his heart as well. "What about the cattle money?" she asked, practical concerns intruding despite the emotion of the moment. Ben's smile turned wry. "Got that right here." With his good arm, he reached beneath his pillow and withdrew a small leather pouch. $30, as promised. Trail boss paid me before I left, said I'd earned it fair despite the trouble. He pressed the pouch into her hand. "Enough to hold off the bank if we add it to what I set aside." Victoria clutched the pouch, feeling the weight of the coins inside the weight of their future. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll let me come home to you when the doc lets me out of here," Ben suggested, his eyes never leaving hers. "Say you'll think about what I've said." Before Victoria could answer, Dr. Wilson's voice called from the outer room. "Miss Valmont, the patient needs his rest now." Victoria rose reluctantly. "I need to tell my sisters you're back," she said, "and that you're hurt but recovering." Ben nodded, his eyelids already growing heavy. "Tell Abigail I've got her book," he murmured. "And Victoria, think about what I said." "I will," she promised, gently squeezing his hand before leaving. The walk home was a blur, Victoria's mind whirling with everything that had happened. Ben was alive, injured but alive. He had brought the money they needed to save their homestead, and he had all but proposed in his way. When she reached the cabin, her sisters bombarded her with questions. Victoria explained about Ben's injury and his return, watching relief flood their young faces. "Will he come back here when he's better?" Abigail asked anxiously. Victoria looked around at the old cabin that had sheltered them their whole lives. Then through the window at the new house Ben had built a house filled with the promise of a different future. "Yes," she said, feeling certainty settle in her heart. "I believe he will." 3 days later, Sheriff Davis brought Ben to the homestead in his wagon. Ben was still weak, his arm in a sling, but his color was better, and he insisted on walking from the wagon to the cabin under his own power. The girls greeted him like a returning hero. Abigail clung to his good arm, chattering about the new book he'd brought her. Margaret bashfully presented him with a fresh baked loaf of bread, while practical Eliza immediately began interrogating him about proper wound care. Victoria hung back, watching the reunion with a full heart. Only when the sheriff had departed and Ben was settled in a chair by the fire did she approach him directly. "How are you feeling?" she asked, noting the lines of pain around his eyes despite his cheerful demeanor with her sisters. "Better now," he answered simply, his gaze holding hers with unmistakable meaning. That evening, after her sisters were asleep, Victoria joined Ben on the small porch where he'd insisted on sitting despite the cold, claiming he needed fresh air after days confined to the doctor's office. "I paid the bank today," she told him, drawing her shawl tighter against the chill. "They've extended the loan properly now with regular payments we can manage." Ben nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Good, that's one worry laid to rest." "One of many," Victoria agreed, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I've been thinking about what you said at the doctor's office." Ben turned to look at her, his face half illuminated by the light spilling from the cabin window. And I think," Victoria said carefully, "that life out here doesn't wait for proper timing, as you said. My parents spent years talking about the home they would build someday. Someday never came for them." She moved closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cold night. "I don't want to wait for someday, Ben, not when tomorrow isn't promised to any of us." Ben's breath caught audibly. "Victoria, are you saying I'm saying yes?" she interrupted, suddenly certain. "Yes to courting, yes to a future together, if that's still what you want." In answer, Ben reached for her hand with his good arm, drawing her gently closer until she stood before him. "It's all I want," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "You and those girls, a family of my own." He hesitated, then asked, "May I kiss you, Victoria Valmont?" Victoria felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she nodded, leaning down slightly to accommodate his seated position. Ben's hand rose to cup her cheek as their lips met in a gentle, tentative kiss that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through her entire body. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Ben rested his forehead against hers. "I think I've been waiting for you my whole life," he confessed. Victoria smiled, feeling a joy she hadn't thought possible in the wake of so much loss. "Then it's a good thing you found us," she whispered. Spring arrived in Cherry Creek with a riot of wildflowers and warm breezes that swept away the last traces of winter. The new house stood completed now, its bright windows gleaming in the sunshine, a proper chimney sending smoke curling toward the blue sky. Inside, the Valmont sisters had created a true home. Curtains sewn from fabric Ben had brought from Cheyenne hung at the windows. Shelves lined the walls, holding not only Abigail's precious books, but also small treasures the girls had collected: pretty stones, bird feathers, dried flowers pressed between pages. Victoria stood in the doorway of the main room, watching as Ben carefully hung a framed photograph of her parents on the wall beside the fireplace. His arm had healed well, though Dr. Wilson warned he might always feel the weather changing in that shoulder. "There," Ben said, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "Your parents should have a place of honor in their daughter's home." Victoria smiled, crossing the room to stand beside him. "They would have liked you," she said softly. "Especially my father. He always said a man should be judged by what he builds, not what he owns." Ben slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her against his side. "And what would he think of what I've built here?" "He would say you built more than a house," Victoria answered, leaning into his embrace. "You built a future." Their courtship had progressed steadily through the winter months. Ben had been a frequent visitor, first as he recovered from his wound, then as he continued work on the house. He had taken Victoria to town for proper dinners at the hotel, endured the good-natured teasing of the local men at church, and even faced down Mrs. Holbrook's scrutiny with unwavering politeness. Through it all, Victoria had watched him with her sisters, noting his endless patience with Abigail's questions, his encouragement of Margaret's cooking experiments, and his respect for Eliza's practical mind. He treated each girl as an individual, never lumping them together as the children or dismissing their concerns. Now, as May's sunshine warmed the new garden they had planted together, Victoria knew with certainty that what had begun as Christian charity had blossomed into something far deeper and more lasting. "I have something to ask you," Ben said that evening as they sat together on the porch of the new house, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Victoria turned to him, noting the unusual nervousness in his typically confident demeanor. "What is it?" Ben took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "I spoke with Reverend Mills yesterday," he began, referring to Cherry Creek's minister, "and with your sisters this morning." Victoria's heart began to race. "You did," Ben nodded, his blue eyes serious, wanted to do things proper. Taking a deep breath, he slid from the bench to one knee before her, still holding her hand. "Victoria Valmont, you are the strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. These past months have been the happiest of my life, despite all the challenges. I can't imagine my future without you and those girls in it." From his pocket, he withdrew a small ring, a simple gold band with a tiny pearl set in the center. "This was my mother's," he explained. "She made me promise I'd only give it to a woman worthy of it." His voice caught slightly. "I've never met anyone more worthy than you." Victoria felt tears welling in her eyes as Ben continued, "Will you marry me, Victoria? Will you let me be a husband to you and a father to those girls? Will you build a life with me here in this home we've made together?" For a moment, Victoria couldn't speak, overcome by emotion. Then, with a radiant smile, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it." Ben's face lit with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Rising to his feet, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that left her breathless. The sound of excited squealing broke them apart. Looking toward the door, they saw all three of Victoria's sisters watching, their faces alight with happiness. Did she say yes? Abigail demanded, bouncing on her toes. Ben laughed, keeping one arm firmly around Victoria's waist. "She did indeed, Miss Abigail." The girls rushed forward, engulfing the couple in an exuberant group embrace. As Victoria held her sisters and her fiancé close, she felt a sense of rightness, of completeness. From the darkest winter of their lives had come this unexpected blessing, a man who had built them not just a house, but a home filled with warmth and love. The wedding took place in June, when the wildflowers were at their peak. The entire town of Cherry Creek turned out for the occasion, the small church filled to overflowing with well-wishers. Even Mrs. Holbrook attended, presenting the couple with a hand-sewn quilt as a wedding gift. Victoria wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered by Margaret's skilled hands. Her sisters served as her attendants, each carrying bouquets of prairie flowers gathered that morning. Ben stood tall and handsome at the altar, his Sunday suit pressed and his boots polished to a high shine. When Reverend Mills pronounced them husband and wife, Ben's kiss was gentle but filled with promise. The cheers of the congregation echoed in Victoria's ears as they walked back down the aisle together, her hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm. The celebration continued at their homestead, where tables laden with food stretched across the yard between the old cabin and the new house. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged the Valmont family in their time of grief now came forward with congratulations and gifts, perhaps shamed by Ben's example of Christian charity or simply caught up in the joy of the occasion. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land that was now truly theirs, Ben drew Victoria aside from the festivities. "Mrs. Jackson," he said, testing the name with evident pleasure, "are you happy?" Victoria looked around at the homestead, transformed at her sisters laughing with the townspeople, at the solid house with smoke curling from its chimney, at the future spreading before them full of possibility. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully, reaching up to touch his face. "You saved us, Ben, not just from the cold or hunger but from despair. Ben shook his head, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. You had the strength all along, Victoria. I just helped you find it. His eyes crinkled with humor. Besides, I got the better end of this bargain, a beautiful wife and 3 spirited sisters-in-law, all in one winter's work. Victoria laughed, leaning against him as they watched the celebration continue. What happens now? She asked, echoing the question Eliza had posed on that bitter day at their parents' graves. A lifetime ago, Ben's arm tightened around her waist as he gazed out at the land stretching before them, at the home they had built together. Now, he said simply, we live. 5 years later, Victoria sat on the same porch, watching as Ben taught their 3-year-old son, Thomas, to ride his first pony. The boy's delighted laughter carried across the yard where Abigail, now 15, was hanging laundry while simultaneously reciting poetry she had learned at school. Margaret, 19 and recently engaged to the schoolteacher's son, was visible through the kitchen window, preparing the evening meal. Eliza, at 17, sat nearby, her head bent over ledgers from the small store she and Ben had opened in town the previous year. So much had changed since that bitter winter when death had seemed to claim all hope along with their parents. The homestead had flourished under Ben's careful management. The original cabin now served as a workshop and storage space, while the house he had built had been expanded to accommodate their growing family. Victoria's hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, where their second child grew. Ben caught her eye across the yard and smiled, that same smile that had warmed her heart on a cold winter's day 5 years ago. As the Wyoming sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the land in gold and amber hues, Victoria thought about the journey that had brought them here. From orphaned sisters huddled together against the cold to this, a family bound by love as much as by blood, a home filled with warmth in every sense of the word. Ben lifted Thomas from the pony and set him on his shoulders, making his way back toward the house. The boy's small hands clutched his father's hat, his face alight with excitement as he called, "Mama, did you see? I rode all by myself." "I saw, my brave boy," Victoria called back, rising to meet them. As Ben reached the porch steps, he set Thomas down to run to his mother, then climbed to stand beside Victoria. His arm slipped around her waist, his hand coming to rest protectively over hers on her growing belly. "Everything all right?" he asked softly, ever attentive to her comfort. Victoria nodded, leaning into his solid warmth. "Everything is perfect," she answered truthfully. Together, they stood watching as the day's last light gilded their home and land, as their son played at their feet, as the sisters Victoria had once feared she would fail to protect moved confidently through the lives they were building. From the deepest winter of despair had come this, a life rich with love, a home filled with warmth, a future bright with promise. All because a cowboy had stopped to help 4 orphaned sisters and in doing so had found his own heart's home.